365 Days is a 2020 Polish erotic thriller that became one of the most talked about and most controversial films to ever land on Netflix. The movie originates from Poland, produced within the Polish film industry rather than Hollywood, and was directed by Barbara Białowież and Tomasz Mondes. Working from a screenplay the two directors co-wrote alongside Tomasz Klimala and the original novelist Blanka Lipinska. The film is based on the first installment of a best-selling Polish romance trilogy written by Lipinska, who built a massive following in Poland before her books were adapted for the screen. Although it is not an American production, its explosive popularity on Netflix turned it into a global phenomenon that Western audiences, including massive numbers of viewers in the United States and the United Kingdom, could not stop talking about, which is why it earns a place in deep dive breakdowns even on channels that usually focus on Hollywood cinema. The movie first opened theatrically in Poland on February 7, 2020, where it performed strongly at the domestic box office, eventually grossing around $9 million in its home country. It later received a limited theatrical release in the United Kingdom on February 14, 2020, bringing in additional box office revenue there before its true explosion in popularity began. That explosion happened when the film arrived on Netflix on June 7, 2020, right in the middle of a period when much of the world was staying indoors due to the pandemic, a timing that many critics believe played a significant role in its runaway streaming success. The premise of 365 Days centers on a young woman from Warsaw named Laura Biel, played by Anna Maria Sikluka, who works as a sales director and finds herself in a stagnant and unfulfilling relationship with her boyfriend, Martin, played by Mateusz Lasowski. Laura is a woman who has built a comfortable professional life but feels increasingly disconnected from passion and adventure. In an attempt to reignite the spark missing from her life, she travels to Sicily with Martin and a group of friends for what is meant to be a relaxing vacation. It is during this trip that her life takes a dramatic and unsettling turn. She crosses paths with Massimo Torricelli, portrayed by Michele Morrone, a powerful and ruthless leader within the Sicilian mafia. The film reveals through flashback that years earlier, Massimo witnessed his father being gunned down during a mafia ambush, and in the same traumatic moment, his eyes fell upon a woman on a nearby beach whose face became permanently etched into his memory as the last vision of peace before his world turned violent. That woman turns out to be Laura. Massimo spends years searching for her, obsessed with the idea that she is somehow tied to his fate, and when he finally identifies her in Sicily, he acts on impulse and has her taken and brought to his private estate. Once there, Massimo tells Laura that he will not force her into anything physical, but that he intends to keep her in his world for exactly 365 days, believing that within that time frame she will fall in love with him the way he has already convinced himself he loves her. What follows is a psychologically charged and controversial dynamic between captor and captive, one that blurs the lines between control, seduction, danger, and the twisted version of romance the film attempts to construct. Laura is transported between opulent locations, dressed in extravagant designer wardrobes, taken on private yachts, and thrust into the dangerous and glamorous underworld that Massimo commands, all while she wrestles internally with fear, attraction, resentment, and confusion about her own feelings toward the man who has stripped away her freedom. As the story unfolds, Laura begins to develop complicated emotions toward Massimo, and the narrative pushes the audience through an increasingly intense series of encounters between the two characters as the mafia world around them threatens to boil over into violence. The film ends on a cliffhanger that leaves Laura's fate uncertain, setting the stage for the sequels that would follow years later. The cast that brought this story to life became instant tabloid and social media sensations following the film's release, with Michele Morrone in particular experiencing an explosion in international fame almost overnight. Morrone, an Italian actor and singer, plays Massimo Torricelli, and his performance, along with his brooding screen presence and the original songs he wrote and performed for the soundtrack, turned him into one of the most searched and discussed celebrities in the world during the summer of 2020. Anna Maria Ciclocca takes on the central role of Laura Beale, portraying a woman whose journey from a bored professional to a captive entangled in a dangerous relationship anchors the emotional core of the film. Supporting the two leads is Bronislaw Roklowski in the role of Mario, along with Otar Saralids as Domenico, who serves as one of Massimo's trusted men within the organization. Magdalena Lamparska plays Olga, Laura's close friend who becomes entangled in the events surrounding her disappearance and eventual return. Natasa Urbanska appears as Anna, while Grzina Sapolowska and Tomasz Stockinger portray Laura's parents, Clara and Tomasz Beale. Johnny Parisi plays Massimo's father, whose death in the film's opening sequence sets the entire plot into motion, and Mateusz Lasowski rounds out the principal cast as Martin, Laura's boyfriend at the start of the story. Together, this ensemble of Polish and Italian actors gave the film its distinct blend of Eastern European drama and Mediterranean mafia intrigue, a combination that contributed heavily to its unique identity among erotic thrillers. When it comes to trailer and promotional material, Netflix leaned heavily into the film's provocative marketing, releasing trailers packed with glamorous imagery of Sicilian coastlines, luxury yachts, high fashion, and the tense chemistry between Morrone and Ciclocca, all designed to hook viewers who were drawn to the same kind of forbidden romance appeal that had previously fueled the success of 50 Shades of Grey. The marketing worked spectacularly well, and the film quickly climbed to the top of Netflix's most-watched charts in dozens of countries around the world. In fact, 365 Days became one of the platform's biggest breakout hits of 2020, holding the #1 spot on Netflix's daily top 10 list in more than 90 countries at various points, and it was reported as the fourth most searched film on Google globally that year. It achieved the rare distinction of returning to the #1 position on Netflix in the United States after briefly being knocked down, giving it a combined total of around 10 days atop the platform's chart, one of the longest runs of its kind at the time. Despite its massive commercial and streaming success, 365 Days became just as famous for the wave of criticism it received from film critics and audiences alike. It holds an infamous 0% rating on Rotten Tomatoes based on the reviews collected from critics, with commentary frequently pointing to weak writing, stiff and unconvincing dialogue, and performances that many reviewers felt lacked genuine emotional depth. The most serious and persistent criticism directed at the film concerns its handling of the relationship between Massimo and Laura, with numerous critics and organizations arguing that the story romanticizes kidnapping, coercion, and behavior that closely resembles psychological and sexual abuse, presenting it instead as a passionate and desirable love story. This criticism placed 365 Days at the center of a broader cultural conversation about the way certain romance narratives package controlling and dangerous behavior as attractive, drawing frequent and unfavorable comparisons to 50 Shades of Grey, which had faced similar backlash years earlier for its own depiction of a power imbalance relationship. Some commentators went so far as to label 365 Days one of the worst-reviewed films to ever achieve this level of mainstream popularity, creating a strange contradiction where a movie could be simultaneously reviled by critics and adored by millions of viewers who kept it trending for weeks. Regardless of where one stands on the film's content, its cultural impact is undeniable. It turned Michel Morrone into an international star, spawned two direct sequels titled 365 Days, This Day and the Next 365 Days that were filmed simultaneously and released the following years. And it cemented itself as one of the defining examples of Netflix's willingness to platform boundary-pushing foreign-language content that could capture the attention of the entire English-speaking world almost overnight. Whether viewed as a guilty pleasure, a controversial misstep, or a fascinating case study in what drives viral streaming success, 365 Days remains one of the most discussed erotic dramas of the last decade, and its story continues to generate conversation. The film opens not in Warsaw, where its heroine lives her ordinary life, but on the sun-drenched coastline of Sicily, years before the main story begins. A convoy of black cars rolls along a winding coastal road, carrying two powerful men from the Torricelli family, an aging mafia don and his teenage son, Massimo. The atmosphere is tense from the very first frame, filled with the quiet dread that always surrounds men who live by violence. As the cars pause near the beach, young Massimo steps out for a moment, and his gaze drifts toward the shoreline, where a beautiful young woman is sunbathing, utterly unaware that she is being watched. In this brief and wordless exchange, something ignites in him, a fascination that will define the rest of his life. Before he can process the feeling, chaos erupts. A rival faction ambushes the convoy, gunfire tears through the quiet afternoon, and Massimo watches in horror as his father is struck down before his eyes. Massimo himself is wounded, collapsing to the ground as his vision blurs, yet even as he fades in and out of consciousness, the image of the woman on the beach remains burned into his memory, becoming, in his mind, inseparable from the moment he lost everything. He survives, but his father does not, and in an instant, the boy is thrust into a world of inherited power, vengeance, and violence that will shape every decision he makes as a man. Years pass, and Massimo Torricelli has grown into the feared and respected head of the Torricelli crime family, a man whose name alone commands silence in rooms full of dangerous men. He is a don in the truest sense, controlling business dealings across Sicily and beyond, feared by rivals and obeyed without question by his own men, chief among them his loyal right hand, Domenico. Yet despite his wealth, his power, and the constant presence of women drawn to his status, Massimo remains hollow, driven by an obsession that never faded. He has never forgotten the woman from the beach. He has spent years quietly searching for her, using every resource available to a man of his position, yet she remains a ghost, a fragment of memory rather than a living, breathing person he can find. His men know better than to question this obsession, understanding that Massimo's fixation is tied to the trauma of that day, the last image of peace before his world became soaked in blood. The story then shifts entirely, transporting the audience to Warsaw, where we meet Laura Beale, a driven and successful sales director whose life looks, from the outside, like the definition of stability. She has a good job, a nice apartment, a long-term boyfriend named Martin, and all the trappings of a comfortable, modern life. Yet underneath that stability, Laura feels an emptiness she cannot quite name. Her relationship with Martin has grown stagnant, defined more by routine than romance, and their intimacy feels obligatory rather than passionate. Laura goes through her days sensing that something essential is missing, though she cannot articulate what that something is. Her mother pushes her toward conventional milestones like marriage, while her close friend Olga, playful and blunt, constantly teases her about her lack of adventure and her unwillingness to take risks in life or love. It is Olga who eventually convinces Laura that she needs a break, urging her to plan a group vacation to inject some excitement back into her life, and Laura, exhausted by her own routine, agrees. The destination chosen for this trip is Sicily, the same land ruled quietly by Massimo Torricelli, though Laura has no idea of the danger that awaits her there. The film lingers on the beauty of the Sicilian coastline as Laura, Martin, Olga, and their friends arrive, soaking in the sun, the ocean, and the lively nightlife of the region. For Laura, the trip feels like an escape from the gray monotony of her life back home, and for a while, it seems like nothing more than a well-earned vacation. However, unbeknownst to her, Massimo's network of contacts has finally located the elusive woman he has searched for since childhood, and word reaches him that she is currently in his territory. Massimo, a man not accustomed to waiting once he has decided on something, immediately sets his plan into motion. He does not approach her directly at first, choosing instead to observe her from a distance, studying her mannerisms, her laughter, her interactions with the people around her, all while wrestling internally with the intensity of finally standing near the person who has haunted his memory for years. The moment that changes everything for Laura arrives when her vacation is abruptly interrupted. Late one night, After a chaotic and disorienting sequence of events, Laura is taken from the group and forced into a car under Massimo's orders. She wakes up disoriented, confused, and terrified, finding herself no longer in a hotel room but aboard a private plane, and then eventually inside a lavish, heavily guarded estate that belongs to Massimo. Laura's fear is immediate and understandable, as any person suddenly ripped from their life would react. She screams, demands answers, and tries desperately to understand who has taken her and why. It is only then that Massimo finally reveals himself to her directly, calm, composed, and unerringly certain of himself despite the chaos he has caused. He tells her who he is, the head of a powerful Sicilian family, and explains, in his own controlled and possessive manner, that she is the woman he saw on the beach as a boy, the same woman whose image sustained him through the worst moment of his life. He tells her that he has waited years to find her, and now that he has, he does not intend to let her go easily. What follows is the central and most controversial premise of the film. Massimo informs Laura that he will not force himself upon her physically, that he will not touch her without her consent, but he insists that she remain with him for exactly 365 days, believing that within that time frame, she will come to love him the way he already believes he loves her. Laura, understandably horrified by this arrangement, refuses to accept it, insisting that she has a life to return to, a boyfriend waiting for her, a career, a family who will worry. Massimo remains unmoved, calmly explaining that her old life will continue to exist as a story for those around her, that explanations will be handled, and that resistance will not change his mind. Trapped in a mansion she does not recognize, surrounded by guards loyal only to Massimo, Laura is forced to reckon with the impossible reality of her situation. The early days of Laura's captivity are defined by fear, anger, and a desperate search for any opportunity to escape. She tests the boundaries of the estate, ring hallways and grounds under the watchful eyes of Massimo's men, searching for any weakness in his elaborate world. Massimo, for his part, does not behave the way Laura initially expects a captor to behave. He showers her with extravagant gifts, designer clothing, jewelry, access to gourmet meals prepared specifically for her, and moments of surprising gentleness that stand in stark contrast to the violent world he controls. He introduces her to his lifestyle gradually, taking her on outings under heavy guard, allowing her glimpses of freedom that are always tightly controlled, and slowly attempting to demonstrate that his intentions, however twisted, are rooted in genuine devotion rather than cruelty. Laura, even as she resents her captivity, cannot help noticing the contradictions within Massimo, a man capable of terrifying violence toward his enemies yet consistently restrained and careful in his treatment of her. As the story progresses, Massimo takes Laura beyond the walls of his estate, bringing her into his broader world of luxury and danger. One of the most memorable sequences in the film takes place aboard Massimo's private yacht, where the two spend an extended period together away from the tension of his criminal empire, sailing along the coastline in scenes meant to showcase both the opulence of his lifestyle and the slowly shifting dynamic between captor and captive. It is during this extended time together that Laura begins to see Massimo not simply as the man who stole her freedom, but as a deeply wounded individual shaped by trauma, loss, and a life forced upon him far too early. She learns more about his childhood, the death of his father, and the isolation that comes with being the head of a criminal empire, and despite every instinct telling her that she should resist, she finds herself drawn to him in ways she does not fully understand or want to admit. The film frames this period as the emotional turning point of the story, the moment where Laura's fear begins to blur into something more complicated, and where Massimo's obsession begins to soften into something resembling genuine emotional connection, even as the fundamental imbalance of power between them never truly disappears. Throughout this period, tension continues to build around the edges of the main relationship. Massimo's criminal world does not pause simply because he has found the woman he has been searching for. Rival factions within the broader mafia landscape remain aware of his activities, and threats to his business and his life continue to loom in the background, creating an undercurrent of danger that occasionally erupts into violence. Domenico, ever loyal, works to protect both Massimo and, by extension, Laura, understanding that his boss's growing attachment to her makes her a potential target for anyone wishing to strike at Massimo through the people he cares about. Meanwhile, back in Warsaw, Laura's disappearance has not gone unnoticed. Martin, confused and increasingly suspicious about the story he has been given regarding her sudden absence, begins to investigate on his own, unaware of the true danger surrounding the situation. Olga, Laura's closest friend, similarly senses that something is deeply wrong, though the full truth remains hidden from those searching for her. As Laura's time in Massimo's world stretches on, the film depicts a gradual and complicated transformation in her feelings. She begins engaging more willingly in the life Massimo has built around her, attending events at his side, interacting with members of his inner circle, and slowly adapting to the rhythms of his world even as she continues to grapple with the reality that she remains, at her core, a prisoner. The relationship between the two deepens emotionally, marked by moments of vulnerability where Massimo reveals more of the man beneath the mafia boss persona, and moments where Laura allows herself brief glimpses of happiness within a situation that began as an act of kidnapping. The film frames these developments as the blossoming of an unconventional romance, though the underlying tension of consent and power imbalance remains a constant undercurrent that colors every interaction between them. A major turning point arrives when Laura is given a brief opportunity to return home, an event that tests the true nature of her feelings toward Massimo. Faced with the choice of resuming her old life with Martin or returning to the dangerous, controlled world Massimo has built around her, Laura is forced to confront the complicated truth of her own heart. Her time apart reveals to her that her old life, once comfortable and secure, no longer holds the same meaning it once did, and the emotional pull toward Massimo, despite everything, proves difficult to ignore. This period of reflection sets the stage for Laura's eventual decision to return to Massimo's world, a choice that the film frames as a genuine, if deeply controversial, embrace of the connection that has grown between them. As the story moves toward its climax, the criminal dangers surrounding Massimo intensify. Threats from rival organizations escalate, forcing Massimo to make difficult decisions to protect both his business and the woman who has become central to his existence. Violence erupts in dramatic fashion as enemies attempt to strike at Massimo's operation, placing both him and Laura in direct danger. Domenico and the rest of Massimo's loyal men move to defend the estate and its inhabitants, leading to tense and chaotic sequences that underscore just how precarious life within this world truly is. Massimo, forced to balance his role as a protector of his criminal empire with his desire to shield Laura from the violence that surrounds him, faces the reality that the life he has built and the love he has found may not be able to coexist peacefully. The film builds toward a wedding, a moment the narrative frames as the culmination of Laura and Massimo's turbulent journey from captor and captive to partners bound together by a complicated, hard-fought devotion. The wedding sequence is depicted with the same lavish extravagance that defines Massimo's world throughout the film, filled with grand settings, opulent fashion, and a sense that Laura has fully stepped into the life Massimo always envisioned for her. Yet even as the wedding appears to represent a resolution to their story, the film undercuts any sense of complete safety or happiness with a final, shocking twist. In the closing moments, tragedy strikes without warning. Laura is violently attacked, an act of brutality that leaves her fate uncertain as the screen cuts to black, leaving the audience with an unresolved and deeply unsettling cliffhanger rather than a traditional happy ending. This abrupt and dramatic conclusion left audiences stunned upon the film's initial release, sparking immediate demand for answers and setting the stage for the story to continue in the sequels that would follow years later. The uncertainty surrounding Laura's fate became one of the most talked about elements of the film's ending, fueling online discussion, fan theories, and anticipation for whatever would come next in the saga of Laura and Massimo. It is this bold, unresolved finale that cemented 365 Days as more than just a standalone film, transforming it into the opening chapter of a larger, multi-part story that would continue to captivate and divide audiences across the world. At the very center of the film's global explosion stands Michele Morrone, the Italian actor whose portrayal of Massimo Torricelli turned him into one of the most searched celebrities on the planet almost overnight. Morrone was born on October 3, 1990, in Bitonto, a town in the Apulia region of southern Italy, though his family relocated to Melegnano in Lombardy while he and his siblings were still young, chasing better job opportunities than their hometown could offer. He grew up as the youngest of 4 children in a working-class household, with a mother who worked as a seamstress and a father who earned a living as a construction worker. Life dealt Morrone a painful blow early on, as his father passed away in 2003 when Michele was only 12 years old, leaving his mother to raise him alongside his 3 older sisters. It was around the same period of his youth that Morrone found his calling, having decided he wanted to become an actor after watching a Harry Potter film at the age of 11, a moment that planted the seed for everything that would follow. His path into the industry was far from smooth or privileged. As a teenager, he worked construction jobs and distributed leaflets on the street simply to scrape together enough money to pay for acting lessons, showing an early determination that would define his career. He was even held back a year in high school due to behavioral issues, a rocky patch that did nothing to slow his ambition. Morrone eventually trained formally in acting at the Teatro Fraschini di Pavia, a respected theater school in Pavia, Italy, where he sharpened the skills that would carry him from small stage productions into television and film. His screen career began modestly in 2011 when he took on the role of Riccardo in Second Chance, a 3-episode Italian web series that was ultimately cancelled after its first season, hardly the launching pad one would expect for a future international star. From there, Morrone slowly built a career through short films such as Il tempo di una sigaretta and E la vita continua, along with appearances in Italian television productions including Come un Delfino, Prevesi ancora, Squadra Anti-Mafia, Sirene, Renata Font, Illinois Processo, and the historical drama series Medici. In 2016, he stepped outside of straightforward acting to compete on the 11th season of Ballando con le Stelle, the Italian version of Dancing with the Stars, where he impressed audiences enough to finish in second place. By 2019, he had landed the lead role of Luigi in the film Bar Giuseppe, continuing to build momentum in the Italian industry. None of that, however, prepared him or anyone else for what happened when 365 Days premiered on Netflix in June of 2020. His portrayal of the brooding, dangerous, yet strangely devoted Massimo Torricelli turned him into a worldwide phenomenon within days, with fans across dozens of countries suddenly obsessed with his brooding stare and imposing presence. What many casual viewers did not initially realize was that Morrone was also a self-taught musician, having picked up the guitar at the age of 25 purely by watching tutorials online. He channeled that talent into a full-length album titled Dark Room, released on Valentine's Day of 2020, just months before the film hit Netflix, and the timing could not have been more perfect. Several songs from that album, including his massively popular single Feel It, became intertwined with the film's identity, with the music video for Feel It featuring scenes alongside his co-star Anna Maria Ciclacca. Morrone's YouTube channel, which he launched in January of 2020, exploded in popularity alongside the film, eventually accumulating millions of subscribers and hundreds of millions of views. He expanded his brand further by launching a women's beachwear clothing line called Aurum Roma in August of 2020, designed in collaboration with fashion designer Chiara Polano, a venture that saw such overwhelming demand at launch that its website reportedly crashed under the traffic. On a personal level, Morrone married Ruba Sada, a Lebanese fashion stylist, in 2014, and the couple share 2 sons, Marcus, born in 2014, and Brando, born in 2017. The marriage ended in divorce in 2018, a period Morrone has openly described as one of the darkest of his life, admitting in interviews that he battled depression after the split, and even considered stepping away from acting entirely before his career took its unexpected turn toward global stardom. Fluent in Italian, English, and Polish, along with several Italian regional dialects, Morrone has continued to build a multifaceted career spanning film, music, fashion, and entrepreneurship since his breakout, reprising his role as Massimo in both sequels and taking on additional international film projects in the years that followed. Standing opposite Morrone as the emotional core of the story is Anna Maria Ciclucca, the Polish actress who transformed from an unknown theater graduate into one of the most discussed performers in Europe almost overnight. Ciclucca was born on May 31, 1992, in Lublin, the largest city in eastern Poland, to her father Jerzy Antoni Ciclucki, a practicing lawyer. She spent much of her childhood immersed in the arts, training in ballet at a community school and attending an artistic high school before her passion gradually shifted toward acting through local theater productions. She completed her secondary education at the well-regarded Hetman Jan Zamoyski High School in Lublin before making the decision to pursue acting professionally at a more serious level. She enrolled at the AST National Academy of Theatre Arts, specifically its Wrocław-based Faculty of Puppetry, a demanding program she reportedly applied to multiple times before being accepted, eventually earning her degree in 2018. Long before the world knew her name, Ciclucca spent years building a foundation in Polish theater, appearing in stage productions across the country and developing a reputation as a serious, disciplined performer well-versed in classical and modern technique. Her transition to screen work began modestly in October of 2019, when she appeared in a single episode of the long-running Polish television series Na Do by Nozli, a medical drama focused on the lives of paramedics and hospital staff, where she played a character named Anila Grabek. That brief television appearance came just months before her life changed permanently, as she was cast in the leading role of Laura Beale in 365 Days, marking her feature film debut in the most dramatic way imaginable. By her own account, Ciclucca was initially hesitant to accept the role after reading the script, fully aware of how intense and controversial the material would be, and she has spoken candidly about how challenging the shoot proved to be, particularly during scenes requiring emotional and physical vulnerability. Fluent in Polish, English, French, and German, she brought a level of linguistic versatility to the multilingual production that served the film well. The reception to her performance was deeply divided. While the film turned her into an internationally recognized name and a face searched by millions around the world, critics were largely unkind to her work, and she found herself nominated for a Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Actress, an unfortunate distinction that came alongside similar criticism directed at nearly every element of the production. Despite the harsh reviews, Ciclucca's newfound fame was undeniable, and she went on to reprise her role as Laura in both sequels, 365 Days, This Day and the Next 365 Days, both released in 2022, cementing her identity as the face of the trilogy even as the films continued to draw criticism from mainstream critics. In the years following the trilogy, Ciclucca made a conscious effort to diversify her career and step outside the shadow of Laura Beale. She returned to her theatrical roots, participating in productions at the In Vitro Theatre in Lublin, and took on the psychologically demanding role of Evie in the 2025 Giallo-inspired horror thriller Compulsion, directed by Neil Marshall and set on the island of Malta, a project that allowed her to showcase dramatic range far removed from the erotic romance genre that made her famous. She also returned to television in 2025, joining the long-running Polish soap opera Pierwoza Milosk in a new role, and even tried her hand at competitive television by participating in the Polish edition of Dancing with the Stars. Throughout her rise to fame, Ciclucca has remained notably private about her personal life, though she has been linked in the past to Polish theater director Łukasz Michalowski, whom she reportedly met while still a student. She has used her massive platform, which includes millions of followers across social media, to speak out in support of women's issues and to encourage the adoption of shelter animals. And in 2021 she auctioned off the iconic red dress she wore in 365 days, donating the proceeds to a Polish charity that supports cancer patients and their families. The supporting cast that surrounded these two central performances brought decades of combined experience from Polish and Italian film, television, and theater. Bronislaw Wroklowski, who played Mario, Massimo's trusted advisor within the Torricelli family, was a veteran Polish actor born in Lodz in 1951, whose long career in Polish cinema and television gave the film a sense of gravitas whenever his character appeared on screen offering counsel or warning of danger. Wroklowski passed away in 2021, not long after the film's massive success, closing out a career that had spanned several decades in Polish entertainment. Otar Saralidze, who portrayed Domenico, Massimo's loyal right-hand man, brings a fascinating personal history to the role. Born on January 14, 1990, in Tbilisi, Georgia, to a mother who worked as a Georgian actress, Saralidze moved with his family to Poland shortly after Georgia declared independence, spending several early years in Krakow before returning briefly to Georgia and then settling permanently in Poland by the age of 12. Growing up multilingual in Georgian, Polish, Russian, and English, he pursued formal actor training at the same Alexander Zelwerowicz Theatre Academy in Warsaw that produced several of his 365 Days castmates, even completing a short acting course in Los Angeles along the way. Before his breakout in the franchise, Saralidze built a career across Polish theater and television, including dubbing work and appearances in various domestic productions, and he continued to expand his career in Polish television projects following the trilogy's success. Magdalena Lamparska, who plays Olga, Laura's loyal best friend, is a Polish actress born on January 6, 1988, in Słupsk, a coastal city in northern Poland. Long before pursuing acting, she was an accomplished chorister, singing with the ensemble Fantasia and winning national a cappella competitions in her youth, while also working as a model and staying active in sports including salsa dancing, athletics, skiing, and volleyball. She graduated from the prestigious Alexander Zelwerowicz Theatre Academy in Warsaw in 2011 and built a substantial career in Polish television well before joining the 365 Days cast, having earned recognition for her breakout performance in the Polish-Russian film Only Not Now, for which she won awards at film festivals in both St. Petersburg and Moscow. She gained wider domestic popularity through the long-running series 39.5 and Hotel 52, and expanded into international work with a role in The Zookeeper's Wife alongside Jessica Chastain. Beyond acting, Lamparska has built a multifaceted career as a published novelist, having written a book inspired by the life of pioneering Polish actress Pola Negri, and as a co-founder of the Jersey Foundation, an organization dedicated to telling women's stories on screen. She is married to travel journalist Bartek Osimek, with whom she shares 2 children. Natasa Urbanska, who portrays Anna, a woman from Massimo's past who threatens Laura's place in his life, is a well-established Polish actress and singer known for her extensive work in musical theater and pop music alongside her film and television roles. Grażyna Sapolowska, cast as Laura's mother Klara Biel, is one of the true veterans of the ensemble, a celebrated Polish film and theater actress born September 19, 1953, in Bydgoszcz, whose decades-long career includes acclaimed work in internationally recognized Polish cinema long before 365 Days. Having trained at the National Academy of Dramatic Art in Warsaw and performed with the National Theatre for years before moving into film, including a notable role in the acclaimed Hungarian film Another Way. Tomasz Stockinger, who plays Laura's father, Tomasz Biel, is another respected figure from Polish television and film with a long-standing career built primarily around television drama roles. Johnny Parisi, who appears briefly but memorably as Massimo's father in the film's opening sequence, whose death sets the entire story into motion, is an Italian actor primarily rooted in Italian television work. Mateusz Lasowski, who plays Martin, Laura's boyfriend at the beginning of the story, rounds out the principal cast as a Polish actor whose role, while limited in screen time, served as the emotional contrast against which Laura's growing connection to Massimo was measured throughout the film. Together, this ensemble of Polish and Italian talent, ranging from seasoned veterans to actors experiencing their first true brush with international fame, gave 365 Days the layered cast dynamic that helped push the film beyond its Polish origins into a truly global cultural moment. Natalia Janicek, who appears in the film as Karolina, is a Polish personality whose career has been built as much on beauty pageants, modeling, and television appearances as on acting itself. She was born on June 15, 1990, in Bielsko-Biała, a city in southern Poland, as the daughter of Iwona and Józef Janicek. From a very young age she was involved with the Bielsko Song and Dance Ensemble, performing traditional Polish folk dance at festivals across the country, an early introduction to performing in front of audiences. She attended school locally in Bielsko-Biała before going on to study at the University of Warsaw, where she completed a program in international business. Her path toward entertainment began through pageantry, and she went on to represent Poland in more than 40 international beauty competitions over the years, including titles associated with Supermodel International and Miss Ocean International. It was at one of these pageants that she caught the attention of producers connected to the Indian film industry, which led to her first major acting role in the Bollywood drama Dreams in the early 2010s, a credit she built much of her early public image around, branding herself in Polish media as the Polish star of Bollywood. She continued building a media presence in Poland by publishing a book in 2016 titled Behind the Scenes of Bollywood, chronicling her experiences working in the Indian film industry, and she was recognized at the JIFA Film Festival with awards for Best International Actress on 2 separate occasions. Beyond her small role in 365 Days, she has appeared in numerous other film and television projects, and became a familiar face on Polish variety and competition programs, including the Polish edition of Dancing with the Stars and the celebrity impersonation Show Your Face Sounds Familiar. In more recent years, her career and public claims about her international fame have become the subject of significant controversy in Poland, with a prominent Polish journalist publishing an extensive investigative report challenging the scale and authenticity of her Bollywood career and accusing her of exaggerating her achievements to the media. That dispute escalated into a lengthy legal battle between Janicek and the journalist, playing out across Polish courts over several years, and it remains one of the more talked about controversies connected to any of the actors who passed through the world of 365 Days. Beyond Janicek, the film rounded out its cast with a number of Polish performers taking on smaller but memorable supporting roles that added texture to the world surrounding Laura and Massimo. Agnieszka Warszawska appeared as a bank manager who briefly crosses paths with Laura in her professional life before her world is upended, a role reflecting Warszawska's steady career within Polish television and film as a reliable character actress known for grounded, naturalistic performances in supporting parts. Przemysław Sadowski took on the role of a hotel manager within the story, another Polish performer whose career has been built primarily through television and stage work in Poland, often appearing in similarly brief but scene-setting roles across Polish film productions. Michael Mikołajczak played the head of security within Massimo's organization, a role that required a commanding physical presence to convincingly portray the loyal muscle protecting a powerful mafia boss, fitting into a career built around similarly intense supporting roles in Polish action and crime productions. Andrea Batti portrayed Alfredo, a member of Massimo's inner circle whose betrayal becomes a plot point later in the story, with Batti working primarily within Italian film and television, lending his Italian background to help ground the Sicilian side of the story in an authentic sense of place. Mateusz Grydlik also appeared as a bank manager in a smaller capacity, another working Polish actor whose credits span supporting television roles. Łukasz Koran played Michael, a Polish actor whose filmography includes a range of supporting parts in domestic film and television productions. Rounding out the ensemble were performers such as Stefano Terrazino and Paulina Bernat, who appeared in the film's dance sequences, bringing choreography and movement expertise that added to the film's more stylized, fashion-driven sequences set within Massimo's lavish world, along with a handful of additional Polish and Italian actors who filled out smaller named and unnamed roles throughout the mansion, the nightclub scenes, and the sequences set aboard Massimo's yacht. Taken together, the cast of 365 Days represented a genuine cross-section of the Polish film and television industry blended with a handful of Italian performers brought in to authenticate the Sicilian half of the story. Ranging from seasoned veterans with decades of stage and screen experience to relative newcomers experiencing their first taste of major exposure through the film's unexpected global reach. While the two leads understandably absorbed the overwhelming majority of the international spotlight, the supporting players each brought their own distinct professional backgrounds to the production, reflecting the broader ecosystem of working actors that Polish cinema and television regularly draws from, even when a single project happens to become an unlikely worldwide phenomenon. Unlike most major studio productions that spend years in development with carefully budgeted line items disclosed to trade publications, 365 Days was assembled quickly and quietly, the product of an independent Polish production team moving fast to capitalize on the enormous popularity of Blanka Lipinska's source novels back home. The exact production budget for the film has never been officially disclosed to the public, which is fairly typical for a mid-sized European production of this kind, especially one made outside the studio system where financial figures tend to stay private unless a company is legally required to report them. What is clear from industry reporting is that this was a modestly scaled production by international standards, nowhere close to the budgets typically associated with major Hollywood romantic dramas, yet the filmmakers managed to stretch their resources cleverly by leaning heavily into the natural, sun-soaked beauty of their filming locations rather than expensive sets or visual effects. The production opted for a fast-tracked approach from the very beginning, moving from adaptation rights to actual filming at a pace that prioritized getting the story onto screens quickly to meet the huge demand that had already built up around the books in Poland, rather than pursuing a slower, more prestige-driven filmmaking process. Directors Barbara Białowież and Tomasz Mondes were brought on specifically because of their track record adapting Polish stories efficiently, and that efficiency shaped almost every decision made throughout the shoot, from the streamlined script that trimmed down some of the novel's more sprawling subplots, to a filming schedule that made the most of a relatively compact list of locations. Production took the cast and crew to a mix of real-world locations across two countries, which became one of the most talked-about aspects of the film once it exploded in popularity, since fans wanted to know exactly where they could go to recreate scenes from the movie. The Polish portions of the story were filmed primarily in and around Warsaw, the city where Laura's ordinary pre-kidnapping life unfolds, along with additional filming in Krakow and the nearby town of Niepołamice, both of which offered the production access to grand historic architecture that could stand in for various interior and exterior settings throughout the story. For the Italian half of the film, representing Massimo's world of Sicilian luxury and danger, the production traveled to Sanremo, a glamorous coastal town in Italy known for its stunning waterfront properties, which gave the filmmakers the sun-drenched, opulent visual backdrop the story demanded without requiring the production to actually base itself in Sicily for the full shoot. The contrast between the two settings, the colder, more corporate world of Warsaw and the warm, luxurious, danger-tinged world of the Italian coastline, became one of the visual pillars of the entire film, and the production design and location scouting teams worked to make sure that shift felt as dramatic on screen as it was meant to feel for Laura's character within the story. One of the most heavily discussed aspects of the production, both during filming and after release, was how the filmmakers approached the film's numerous intimate scenes, which needed to look convincing and passionate on screen without requiring the actors to do anything that crossed into actual pornography. Cinematographer Bartek Cierlicka spoke openly about the visual approach the production took toward these sequences, explaining that the goal was to make the intimacy feel authentic, allowing the camera to capture whispered dialogue, heavy breathing, sweat, and genuine physical closeness between the actors, while still being careful never to cross into content that would functionally be pornographic rather than dramatic. To achieve this balance, the production made heavy use of practical techniques rather than leaning on visual effects, employing prosthetic devices, careful blocking, and precise camera angles that allowed scenes to appear far more explicit than what was actually happening physically between the performers. This meant that even the film's most talked about sequences, including the yacht scene and an early sequence set aboard a private plane, were built through a combination of choreography, camera trickery, and physical props rather than anything resembling real intercourse between Morrone and Ciclucca. The production reportedly varied its visual approach from scene to scene depending on where the characters were in their emotional journey, aiming for a rougher, more aggressive visual language in earlier scenes reflecting the power imbalance of the relationship, and gradually shifting towards something meant to feel more mutual and tender as the story progressed, at least according to the way the filmmakers described their intentions. Despite the seriousness and intensity of the subject matter, the atmosphere on set was reportedly filled with far more laughter and awkwardness than viewers watching the finished, polished scenes might expect, and both lead actors have spoken candidly in interviews about just how strange and occasionally hilarious it was to film some of the movie's most talked about moments. One of the funniest and most widely repeated stories from production involves the airplane sequence early in the film, in which Massimo receives distressing news and heads to the back of his private plane for an intimate encounter with a flight attendant. Morrone has explained in interviews that he was introduced to the actress playing that role with almost no time to build any rapport before the cameras started rolling, and by the time he sat down to discuss the scene afterward in an interview, he could not even remember her name, a detail he shared with a laugh rather than any embarrassment. According to Morrone, the scene, which required the use of a prosthetic device to simulate the physical act without any real contact taking place, quickly became more comedic than sensual once filming actually began, largely because members of the crew standing just off camera started laughing at the sheer absurdity of what they were watching unfold. Morrone has said that the laughter proved contagious, admitting that he found himself cracking up right alongside the crew even as the cameras kept rolling, turning what was meant to be one of the film's more intense moments into one of its most chaotic to actually shoot. He described the entire experience simply as awkward but funny, a phrase that has since been repeated constantly by fans discussing the making of the film. That sense of nervous laughter and camaraderie extended well beyond that single scene and seemed to define much of the working relationship between Morrone and Ciclucca throughout the shoot. Ciclucca has been open about how intimidating the role felt to her before filming even began, admitting that after reading the script for the first time, she strongly hesitated to accept the part at all, largely because of how physically and emotionally demanding the material would be for what was her very first major screen role. She has specifically discussed her nervousness surrounding the film's nudity requirements, a fear that many first-time performers in this kind of intense material understandably carry into their first day on set. Rather than letting that discomfort create tension between the two leads, both actors have said that the shared awkwardness of filming such physically demanding scenes together actually pushed them to form a genuine friendship remarkably quickly. Morrone has described the dynamic bluntly, explaining that the two of them were essentially forced into becoming close simply because of what the material required of them, joking that they had no choice but to become friends, though he was quick to add that the friendship that formed under those pressured circumstances turned out to be completely real and has lasted well beyond the production itself. That closeness became useful almost immediately, since Ciclucca has said that having someone she trusted standing across from her during the more vulnerable moments of filming made the entire process considerably easier to get through, and the two leads leaned on each other constantly to push through scenes that neither of them found particularly comfortable to shoot. Adding another layer of unexpected humor to the production was a specific detail about one of the film's more talked about sexual gestures, which author Blanka Lipinska revealed had actually been removed from earlier cuts of the film before being deliberately reinstated at her own insistence. She has explained in interviews that the gesture, which became one of the most discussed and meme-worthy moments among viewers once the film reached Netflix, was something she considered a genuinely popular and normal gesture among couples in Poland, and she pushed specifically to have it restored to the final version of the film after it had initially been cut. A decision that ended up fueling endless online conversation and commentary once audiences actually saw the finished product. It is the kind of behind-the-scenes tug-of-war between author and filmmakers that rarely makes it into the public discussion around the film, yet it speaks to just how hands-on Lipinska remained throughout the adaptation process, given her involvement not just as the original novelist, but as a credited screenwriter on the project as well. Beyond the two leads, the wider cast and crew also brought moments of levity to a shoot that could otherwise have felt heavy given its subject matter. Supporting cast members have shared clips and photos over the years showing lighter moments between takes, including playful interactions between Morone and castmates like Otar Saralids and Tomasz Stockinger, with fans and even the author herself occasionally sharing candid, unscripted photos from the set showing the cast joking around between setups rather than staying locked into the tense, dramatic energy required in front of the camera. These glimpses behind the curtain, often shared years later once the cast had become internationally famous, helped humanize a film that had otherwise become a lightning rod for serious criticism, showing audiences that despite the dark, controversial themes explored on screen, the day-to-day reality of the shoot involved plenty of normal, occasionally silly moments between a group of actors and crew members simply trying to get through a demanding shooting schedule together. Michel Morone has also spoken more broadly about how strange it initially felt for him personally to film some of the film's most explicit content, admitting in interviews that he found certain moments genuinely weird to shoot at first, particularly given how exposed and vulnerable the material required him to be in front of a full crew. He has said that what eventually made the experience easier was simply his approach to acting in general, explaining that he has always tried to bring total authenticity to any role he takes on, which helped him push through the initial discomfort once filming got underway. Over the course of the shoot, that discomfort reportedly gave way to something closer to genuine fun between him and Sikluka, as the two actors settled into a rhythm together and found ways to make even the most demanding scenes feel more manageable through humor and mutual support. Morone has also had to repeatedly clarify, sometimes with visible exasperation mixed with amusement, that the intensity audiences saw on screen between him and Sikluka was purely a product of skilled acting rather than any real off-screen relationship, joking in one Instagram live session that the chemistry simply looked real because the two of them were good at their jobs. A statement that did little to stop fans from continuing to speculate about their relationship for years afterward. The production's approach to authenticity extended even to smaller practical details that ended up generating their own quiet behind-the-scenes stories, such as the coordination required to make sure both principal cast members were comfortable and prepared before filming particularly demanding sequences. Given that both Morone and Sikluka have discussed publicly how much trust was required between them to get through certain scenes, the production reportedly relied on open communication and careful planning ahead of each demanding shoot day, allowing both actors input into how comfortable they felt with the choreography before cameras rolled. A level of care that helped offset some of the inherent awkwardness of the material even when things occasionally went sideways in genuinely funny ways. Once filming actually began. Once the film became a runaway Netflix hit in the summer of 2020, the momentum from its box office run in Poland, where it grossed roughly $9 million during its theatrical release, combined with its explosive streaming success, made a sequel all but inevitable, though the production of that follow-up ran into its own very real behind-the-scenes complication in the form of the global pandemic. Plans for the sequel, eventually titled 365 Days, This Day, were delayed specifically because international travel and large-scale film production became impossible during the early stages of the pandemic, with Cicluca herself confirming during a live Q&A session with co-star Magdalena Lamparska that the team would not be able to travel abroad that year to begin shooting as originally planned. It was not until May of 2021 that Netflix confirmed production had finally started on 2 sequels simultaneously, filmed back-to-back in both Poland and Italy, bringing back Moroni, Cicluca, and Lamparska alongside the rest of the principal cast to continue a story that had captivated, confused, and controversial audiences all over the world in equal measure. Taken together, the making of 365 Days paints a picture of a production defined by contrasts, a modestly budgeted, quickly assembled Polish film that ended up generating conversations, controversy, and box office numbers wildly disproportionate to its scale, built on a foundation of practical filmmaking techniques, careful choreography, and a surprising amount of genuine laughter shared between a cast that had to navigate uncomfortable, physically demanding material together while trying to keep the process as human and grounded as possible behind the scenes, even as the finished product on screen continued to spark heated debate across the globe. To understand why 365 Days became such an enormous cultural flashpoint, it helps to first understand where it came from. The film is rooted in a literary phenomenon that had already taken Poland by storm years before Netflix ever got involved. Author Blanka Lipinska published the first novel in her 365 DNI trilogy in 2018, and the books became runaway bestsellers domestically, tapping into a long-standing tradition of steamy, dominance-driven romance fiction that had proven wildly popular with readers around the world following the massive success of 50 Shades of Grey earlier in the decade. Lipinska has been open about the fact that she found the 50 Shades series lacking in certain respects, describing it in interviews as one of the weaker entries in its own genre, and she has said that reaction was part of what motivated her to write her own version of a dominant billionaire romance, this time filtered through Polish and Italian cultural sensibilities rather than an American or British lens. That connection to 50 Shades of Grey ended up following the film adaptation everywhere it went, with critics almost universally framing 365 Days as a Polish answer to the earlier franchise, sometimes generously and often dismissively, with some reviewers and even the Golden Raspberry Awards themselves formally categorizing it as an unofficial remake or rip-off of the earlier property when handing out award nominations. The broader genre that both 365 Days and 50 Shades of Grey belong to has deep historical roots stretching back decades within popular romance fiction, often referred to informally as the dominant alpha billionaire subgenre, which itself draws on even older traditions within romance literature, sometimes nicknamed bodice ripper novels, a term used to describe historical romance books from the 1970s and 1980s that frequently combine danger, captivity, and passionate, power-imbalanced relationships between a domineering male love interest and a woman who is swept into his world against her initial will. These stories have always occupied a complicated cultural space, immensely popular with large segments of readers while simultaneously drawing sustained criticism from feminist scholars and cultural commentators who argue that they normalize coercive, and even abusive relationship dynamics by packaging them as aspirational fantasy. 365 Days arrived directly into this long-running cultural debate, and in many ways became one of the most extreme and widely visible examples of it, since unlike a novel read privately, a Netflix film algorithmically pushed to hundreds of millions of subscribers around the world could not avoid becoming a matter of intense public discussion the moment it started trending. The timing of the film's release played an enormous, arguably decisive role in its cultural impact. 365 Days landed on Netflix internationally on June 7, 2020, squarely in the middle of a period when much of the world remained under pandemic-related lockdowns and restrictions, with hundreds of millions of people stuck at home with far more free time for streaming than usual and, as several critics pointedly noted at the time, considerably fewer opportunities for real-world romantic or physical intimacy. This context helped fuel exactly the kind of runaway, almost accidental viral success that streaming platforms rarely predict in advance, since 365 Days arrived with minimal traditional marketing compared to a typical major release, relying instead on Netflix's recommendation algorithm and a rapidly spreading wave of social media discussion, memes, and TikTok clips to build its audience organically. The film's sudden ubiquity became something of a cultural case study in how streaming-era word of mouth could turn a modestly budgeted foreign-language production into a genuine worldwide phenomenon within a matter of days, achieving the rare distinction of returning to the #1 spot on Netflix's American chart after briefly losing the top position, ultimately compiling roughly 10 total days atop the platform's most watched list in the United States alone, a milestone that made headlines across entertainment journalism even before most American audiences had ever heard the names Michelle Morrone or Anna Maria Ciclucca. That explosive popularity collided almost immediately with a wave of serious cultural criticism that positioned 365 Days at the center of an ongoing, broader conversation about representations of consent, coercion, and power dynamics in mainstream entertainment. Numerous critics writing for major outlets described the film's central relationship in blunt terms, characterizing the story as a glamorized depiction of kidnapping and psychological entrapment dressed up in the visual language of luxury and romance. Variety's review famously called the film politically objectionable while still acknowledging its accidental camp value, and other major outlets including The Guardian and Cosmopolitan piled on with similarly harsh assessments, criticizing everything from its dialogue to its portrayal of intimacy as feeling mechanical rather than genuinely passionate despite its explicit content. Beyond traditional film criticism, the movie became a target for organized activism specifically focused on its handling of consent. Multiple Change.org petitions sprang up across different countries during the summer of 2020, including one organized by a French feminist collective called Collectif Sourcières that specifically petitioned Netflix France to remove the film, eventually gathering tens of thousands of signatures. While a separate international petition campaign accused the film of romanticizing what campaigners described as behavior resembling Stockholm Syndrome, ultimately collecting tens of thousands of additional signatures of its own. Even prominent figures within the entertainment industry weighed in critically, with provocative French filmmaker Gaspar Noé offering a characteristically blunt and dismissive assessment of the film's popularity in an interview, suggesting its success said more about audience appetite than artistic merit. Musician Duffy also became a notable voice in the backlash, publicly criticizing the film for what she described as glamorizing sexual violence, a message that carried particular weight given her own history as a public advocate against sexual assault. At the same time that this activism and critical backlash was unfolding, an entirely separate and much larger segment of the global audience embraced the film specifically as an unapologetic guilty pleasure, treating its melodrama, its over-the-top luxury aesthetic, and even its clunky dialogue as part of its appeal rather than a flaw to be criticized. This divide between institutional critical response and raw audience consumption became one of the most frequently discussed aspects of the film's entire cultural moment, illustrating a phenomenon that has become increasingly common in the streaming era, where algorithmically boosted content can achieve massive viewership numbers almost entirely disconnected from traditional critical validation. The film's rare 0% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, compiled from the relatively small pool of professional critics who reviewed it, existed simultaneously with its position as one of the most streamed and most searched pieces of entertainment content anywhere in the world during the summer of 2020. A contradiction that entertainment journalists return to again and again when trying to explain exactly what kind of cultural object the film had become. That critical drubbing eventually found its most formal, ceremonial expression at the Golden Raspberry Awards, often referred to as the Razzies, the long-running Hollywood anti-awards event that mockingly recognizes what its voting members consider the worst achievements in film each year. At the 41st Golden Raspberry Awards ceremony, held in March of 2021, 365 Days received 6 nominations, tying it with the Robert Downey Jr.-led Dolittle remake for the most nominations of that particular award cycle, with nods spanning Worst Picture, Worst Director for Barbara Bialawas and Tomasz Mondes, Worst Actor for Michelle Morone, Worst Actress for Anna Maria Ciclocca, Worst Screenplay, and Worst Remake, Rip-Off, or Sequel, the latter category reflecting the persistent framing of the film as an unofficial copy of 50 Shades of Grey. When the actual ceremony took place, the film ultimately won a single Razzie for Worst Screenplay, a genuinely historic, if dubious, milestone since it marked the first time in the history of the Golden Raspberry Awards that a Polish production had ever been recognized by the organization at all, a fact that author Blanka Lipinska addressed directly in interviews, noting with a mix of humor and pride that receiving international recognition of any kind, even mockingly, represented a kind of success no Polish film had previously achieved on that particular stage. Poland has its own domestic equivalent of the Razzies known as the Wease Awards, or Snake Awards, an ironic anti-award ceremony established in 2012 specifically to highlight the worst achievements in Polish cinema each year, and 365 Days similarly dominated that ceremony's 2021 edition, winning statuettes for Worst Film of the Year, Worst Screenplay, and Worst Actors Duo for the pairing of Morone and Ciclocca, cementing the film's unusual dual identity as both a genuine commercial phenomenon and a widely mocked critical punching bag within its own home country. Beyond the specific debates over consent and quality, 365 Days also carries significant cultural weight simply as a landmark moment for Polish cinema on the world stage. Prior to its release, Polish-language films rarely achieve this level of mainstream global visibility outside of festival circuits or award-season prestige dramas, and 365 Days became, almost overnight, the most internationally recognized piece of Polish popular culture in years, introducing millions of viewers around the world to Polish actors, Polish filmmaking, and even the Polish language itself, since many international viewers specifically sought out the film in its original language, with subtitles rather than dubbed versions. This unexpected cultural export status placed 365 Days within a broader trend that had been building across Netflix's international content strategy throughout the late 2010s, as the streaming giant increasingly invested in and promoted non-English language original productions from countries including South Korea, Spain, Germany, and Poland, discovering that algorithmically driven global distribution could turn a modestly budgeted foreign production into a worldwide hit in ways that traditional theatrical distribution models never could. In that sense, 365 Days sits alongside other international Netflix breakout hits as an early and particularly extreme example of exactly how disruptive streaming-era distribution could be to traditional assumptions about which countries and languages could produce truly global entertainment phenomena. The film's Sicilian mafia setting also taps into a much older and deeply established tradition within global popular culture, one stretching back through decades of American and Italian cinema that has romanticized organized crime figures as glamorous, powerful, and paradoxically magnetic despite the violence underpinning their world. 365 Days borrows heavily from this well-worn cinematic shorthand, presenting Massimo's criminal empire primarily through the lens of luxury, opulent villas, private yachts, designer fashion, and lavish parties rather than dwelling extensively on the actual mechanics or human cost of organized crime. A choice that mirrors how numerous mafia-adjacent romance and thriller films before it have similarly used the aesthetic trappings of that world as a backdrop for stories that are ultimately more concerned with romance and desire than with crime itself. This aestheticized version of the mafia, sometimes referred to by cultural critics as mafia chic, has a long pedigree in popular entertainment, and 365 Days leans into it unapologetically, using Sicily's genuine natural beauty and Italy's broader cultural association with luxury, fashion, and romance as visual shorthand for danger made desirable. The film's soundtrack and Michelle Morone's simultaneous rise as a recording artist added yet another layer to its cultural footprint, blurring the line between film promotion and genuine music industry crossover success in a way that became its own small pop culture story. Marone's original songs, particularly his single Feel It, charted internationally and became closely intertwined with the film's identity, with the accompanying music video featuring scenes alongside Ciclocca that further fueled public fascination with the two lead actors and speculation about their off-screen relationship. This kind of film-to-music crossover success, where a soundtrack becomes nearly as culturally significant as the film itself, echoes similar phenomena tied to earlier romantic and erotic dramas, and it helped extend the cultural lifespan of 365 Days well beyond its initial viral streaming moment. As Marone's music continued generating its own independent fanbase and chart success even among listeners who had never watched the film itself. Ultimately, the cultural legacy of 365 Days is defined by exactly the kind of contradiction that made it so endlessly discussed in the first place. It stands simultaneously as a genuine landmark in Polish cinema's global visibility, a lightning rod for serious and legitimate feminist criticism regarding the portrayal of consent in mainstream entertainment, an object lesson in how pandemic-era streaming behavior and algorithmic distribution could turn a modestly resourced foreign film into a worldwide sensation almost overnight, and one of the most mocked and formally recognized bad films of its era according to major anti-award institutions on two different continents. Few films in recent memory have managed to occupy such wildly divergent cultural positions all at once, celebrated by millions of casual viewers as an escapist guilty pleasure, condemned by critics and activists as harmful and regressive, and studied by industry observers as a genuinely unusual case of streaming-era virality. All of which ensured that 365 Days would remain a reference point in conversations about erotic cinema, consent in media, and the strange, unpredictable mechanics of what actually goes viral in the modern entertainment landscape for years to come. Perhaps the single most ironic fact about the entire 365 Days phenomenon is the almost comedic gap between how professional critics received the film and how the rest of the world actually watched it. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film managed the rare and almost impressive feat of scoring a flat 0% approval rating from the critics who reviewed it, a number so low that it placed the movie in the same rarefied territory as some of the most infamous flops in cinema history. And yet, at the very same moment critics were calling it one of the worst films ever made, ordinary viewers around the world were making it one of the most watched pieces of content in the history of Netflix, propelling it to the #1 spot in dozens of countries and giving it one of the longest total runs at #1 in the United States that the platform's chart had ever recorded. A film that professional reviewers universally agreed had almost no artistic merit somehow became more culturally inescapable during the summer of 2020 than movies that critics adored, a contradiction so stark that entertainment journalists spent weeks simply trying to explain how something so widely panned could simultaneously be so widely consumed. That same irony followed the film directly into the world of formal award recognition. When the Golden Raspberry Awards, the mock ceremony designed specifically to humiliate the worst films of the year, announced its nominees for 2020, 365 Days walked away with 6 nominations, tying it with a major American studio remake for the most nominations of that entire award cycle. In one of the strangest twists connected to the film, this dubious honor actually marked a genuine historical milestone, since it was the very first time in the decades-long history of the Golden Raspberry Awards that a Polish production had ever been recognized at all, for better or worse. Author Blanka Lipinska herself leaned into this irony rather than shy away from it, telling a Polish newspaper in an interview that the nominations were something to be pleased about precisely because no Polish film in history had ever achieved that kind of international recognition before, treating a mockery award as a genuine milestone for her home country's film industry. When the ceremony actually took place, the film went on to win the Razzie for Worst Screenplay, credited jointly to the film's screenwriters and to Lipinska herself for the original novel, making her, quite literally, an internationally recognized award-winning writer for a screenplay that had just been formally declared one of the worst-written scripts of the year. Poland's own domestic equivalent of the Razzies, the Wheeze or Snake Awards, piled on with the same irony, naming Michelle Morrone and Anna Maria Sikluka the worst on-screen couple of the year at the very same time that their chemistry together was precisely what was driving hundreds of millions of people around the world to keep watching, share clips, and obsess over their characters' relationship online. The irony surrounding Michelle Morrone's own personal journey to the role of Massimo Torricelli is perhaps even more striking than anything that happened after the film's release. Before he ever received the script for 365 Days, Morrone had essentially given up on acting altogether. He was newly divorced, financially struggling, and by his own account severely depressed, having taken a job working as a gardener in a small village in northern Italy simply to get by. He has described spending months laboring alongside farm animals, tending to cows and chickens, about as far removed from international stardom as a person could imagine. It was during this exact period, when Morrone had essentially resigned himself to walking away from the entertainment industry entirely, that his agent called with an offer from a team of Polish filmmakers looking to cast the lead role of a wealthy, commanding Sicilian mafia boss in a film adaptation of a best-selling novel. Morrone has said he told his gardening employer he was too sick to come in that day and immediately boarded a plane for Poland instead, a spontaneous decision that, within a matter of months, transformed him from an anonymous gardener into one of the most recognized and most searched men on the planet. There is a particularly sharp irony embedded in that transformation, since the very depression, isolation, and sense of lost identity that Morrone experienced during his lowest point ended up feeding directly into the brooding intensity he brought to a character whose entire arc is defined by trauma, obsession, and emotional isolation. Meaning the darkest chapter of the actor's real life may have inadvertently shaped the most successful performance of his career. A similarly layered irony surrounds the film's central creative decision regarding one of its most talked about and most meme-worthy moments, a specific gesture during one of the film's intimate scenes that became instantly infamous once the movie reached global audiences. According to author Blanka Lipinska, that exact moment had originally been cut from earlier versions of the film during editing, only for her to personally insist that it be reinstated before the movie's final release, explaining in interviews that she considered it an authentic and commonly understood gesture between couples in Poland. The irony here is twofold, since the very moment that critics and international audiences pointed to as one of the most gratuitous and shocking parts of the entire film was something the filmmaking team had actually tried to remove for being excessive, and it was ultimately restored not by studio executives chasing controversy for its own sake, but by the film's original novelist fighting to preserve what she viewed as an accurate, culturally specific detail of intimacy rather than shock value. What was meant as a small gesture toward authenticity ended up becoming, quite unintentionally, one of the most widely discussed and parodied single moments to come out of the entire production. The film's title itself became the source of an unplanned irony once the real-world production timeline for its sequel got underway. A story literally named after the idea of a single year, 365 days, ended up taking nearly 2 full years to bring its own sequel to screens, thanks almost entirely to the global disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Filming on the follow-up, originally expected to move forward on a relatively normal post-release schedule, was pushed back specifically because international travel and large-scale film production became logistically impossible during the early waves of the pandemic, forcing the cast to sit in limbo for far longer than a title built around the number 365 might have suggested. It was not until May of 2021, nearly a full year after the original film's Netflix premiere, that production on 2 sequels finally began simultaneously, with the first of them not reaching audiences until April of 2022, meaning the wait between the original film and its sequel ended up stretching considerably longer than the very number embedded in the franchise's name. There is also a distinct irony in how the film's most explosive and controversial scenes were actually produced behind the camera compared to how they appeared on screen. Michel Morrone has openly described the filming of one of the movie's most talked about intimate sequences as one of the most awkward experiences of his career, explaining that he was introduced to the actress involved mere minutes before cameras rolled, with the entire moment relying on a prosthetic device rather than any real physical contact between the performers. What audiences experienced as one of the more intense and provocative sequences in the film was, according to Morrone's own account, closer to controlled comedy on set, with crew members openly laughing just off camera at the absurdity of what was actually being simulated, a stark contrast between the sultry seriousness of the finished product and the genuinely light-hearted chaos of its actual production. This same irony extends to the broader claim Morrone made comparing his film favorably to 50 Shades of Grey, arguing in interviews that 365 Days succeeded specifically because it was willing to be rougher and more explicit than its predecessor. Even as critics used that same explicitness as one of their primary reasons for declaring the film one of the worst and most irresponsible releases of the year. Even the film's portrayal of organized crime carries its own layer of unintentional irony. Despite being built around the supposedly dangerous and ruthless world of Sicilian mafia power, numerous viewers and reviewers pointed out that the film's depiction of mob life felt far closer to a glossy fashion advertisement than anything resembling the gritty reality typically associated with organized crime cinema. With one widely shared audience review joking that the film's mafia characters looked more like comic book figures than believable criminals, and even suggesting, somewhat sarcastically, that real mobsters would have made short work of the characters depicted on screen. That same review noted, with a kind of unintentional comedic honesty, that background characters appearing briefly in nightclub scenes actually felt more authentic and true to life than the supposedly hardened crime family at the center of the story, an ironic inversion in which minor extras ended up feeling more real than the film's central power structure. Perhaps one of the most quietly ironic aspects of the entire saga involves Netflix's own promotional strategy, or rather its near total absence of one. Unlike most major releases that arrive with extensive marketing campaigns, billboard advertising, and press tours, 365 Days reached global audiences with comparatively minimal traditional promotion, relying almost entirely on Netflix's recommendation algorithm and organic social media buzz, particularly on TikTok, to build its audience. A film that ultimately became one of the platform's most talked about and most streamed releases of the entire year achieved that status with barely any of the promotional infrastructure typically required to manufacture that kind of success. An outcome so unusual that it became its own case study within the entertainment industry regarding just how unpredictable algorithm-driven virality could be compared to traditional Hollywood marketing wisdom. The reaction from outside the world of mainstream film criticism added another layer of irony, particularly the blunt commentary offered by provocative French filmmaker Gaspar Noé, a director whose own body of work includes some of the most sexually explicit and deliberately controversial films ever made within arthouse cinema. Noé, dismissing the popularity of 365 Days in an interview, suggested that its success said more about basic human physical urges than any real artistic value, a critique that carries its own irony given that Noé's own filmography has faced remarkably similar accusations of gratuitous content over the years, meaning one of cinema's most controversial and boundary-pushing directors was, in effect, criticizing another film for engaging in exactly the kind of provocation his own career has long been built around. Finally, there is a quieter, more grounded irony buried in the aftermath of the controversy, one less about mockery and more about the strange dual life the film ended up living. Even as international petitions gathered tens of thousands of signatures demanding Netflix remove the film for glamorizing kidnapping and coercive relationships, and even as feminist organizations and public figures spoke out forcefully against its themes, Anna Maria Ciclucca took the very red dress that had become one of the film's most iconic and most criticized visual symbols and auctioned it off for charity, directing the proceeds toward a Polish organization supporting cancer patients and their families. A costume so tightly associated with one of the most controversial and criticized romantic depictions in recent streaming history ended up, in its final real-world chapter, quietly funding genuine medical support for people fighting a very real and very different kind of battle, a small but telling reminder that the story surrounding 365 days, both on screen and off, was rarely as simple as either its harshest critics or its most devoted fans made it out to be. There are films that succeed quietly, find their audience slowly, and earn their place in popular culture through sustained critical appreciation and word of mouth built over years. And then there are films that arrive like a storm, dividing opinion instantly, generating controversy before most people have even had a chance to watch them, and somehow becoming more popular because of the outrage surrounding them rather than in spite of it. 365 Days, the Polish romantic drama released on Netflix in 2020, belongs firmly and emphatically to the second category. It became one of the most watched films on Netflix in the history of the platform within days of its release, reaching the #1 spot in an extraordinary number of countries simultaneously and generating a volume of conversation, debate, criticism, and passionate defense that very few films of any kind managed to produce. It was called dangerous by critics, intoxicating by fans, irresponsible by academics, and addictive by the millions of viewers who watched it repeatedly in the weeks and months following its release. But beneath the surface of all of that noise, beneath the controversy and the passionate reactions in both directions, there exists within 365 days a collection of ironies so deep, so layered, and so revealing about the world that produced and consumed this film that they deserve to be examined carefully and seriously. Not the surface ironies that anyone can spot within the first 20 minutes of watching, but the deep structural ironies that run through the entire film and through the cultural moment that made it possible. Because 365 Days is not simply a controversial film. It is an accidental document of contradictions, a mirror held up to a specific cultural moment that reflects back something complicated and uncomfortable about what audiences around the world were hungry for, what they told themselves they wanted, and what they actually responded to when it was placed in front of them. Today on this channel we are going to go through every major irony embedded in this film and examine what each one tells us about the movie, about its audience, and about the world we are all living in together. The central irony that the entire film is built upon. The single greatest irony at the heart of 365 Days is the one that is simultaneously the most obvious and the most profound, and it is the irony that the film's creators, producers, and marketing team appeared to be either completely unaware of or deliberately chose to ignore. The film presents a kidnapping as a love story. Not a kidnapping that is resolved quickly and treated as the crime it is. Not a kidnapping that serves as a dark, opening chapter before a story of healing and recovery begins. A kidnapping that is presented from beginning to end as the foundation and the origin story of a passionate, beautiful, and deeply romantic relationship between two people who are, the film insists, genuinely meant for each other. The irony here is not simply that kidnapping is wrong and the film treats it as romantic. The irony goes much deeper than that. The irony is that the film uses every single cinematic language tool available to it, the lush Italian and Polish locations, the extraordinarily beautiful cinematography, the glamorous fashion and luxury settings, the passionate music score, and the magnetic chemistry between its two leads, to make the audience feel exactly what the kidnapped character is supposed to feel. It manufactures desire for a situation that any rational examination identifies immediately as a violation of the most basic human rights. The camera does not show us a crime. The camera shows us a fantasy. And the deepest irony of all is that it works. It worked on an enormous scale. millions of viewers watched the film and responded not with horror or outrage at the situation being depicted but with longing, excitement, and a desire to see more. The film set out to make audiences fall in love with a love story, and it succeeded so completely that most of those audiences had to be reminded by critics and commentators that what they had just watched was not technically a love story at all by any conventional moral definition. This is the central irony, and it is impossible to discuss any other irony in the film without returning to it, because every other contradiction and paradox in 365 days is in some way a consequence of or a variation on this foundational one. The film is built on a lie that it tells so beautifully and so convincingly that the lie becomes indistinguishable from the truth for the duration of the viewing experience, and the audience's willingness to accept that lie, their active desire to accept it, is the most interesting and troubling thing about the entire phenomenon. The irony of the female protagonist's response. Laura Beale, the female lead of the film, is introduced to us as a strong, independent, and professionally accomplished woman. She works in a high-level position in the hotel industry. She is clearly intelligent and capable. She has a life, a relationship, and a career that she has built for herself. The film takes care to establish these qualities early on because they are essential to the specific irony it is about to deploy. A woman who has nothing would have nothing to lose in being taken. The irony of the film requires that Laura have everything, because the drama depends on our understanding that this is a woman who chose her own path, and who is now being told, very forcefully and very literally, that she has no choice at all. Then comes the irony. Laura, this strong and independent woman, does not respond to her captivity with the sustained resistance, fury, and determination to escape that any realistic portrayal of such a situation would require. She responds instead with a gradual softening, a slow and carefully filmed emotional journey toward accepting and eventually reciprocating the feelings of the man who took her. The film presents this as a love story. The irony is that it is actually a portrait of a process that psychologists have a clinical name for, and that name is not romance. The film takes a genuinely understood psychological phenomenon and reframes it as proof of true love. And the irony is that this reframing is so skillfully executed that it required mental health professionals, academics, and film critics to explicitly name what was happening in order to give audiences the language to examine their own response to the story. The further irony within this irony is that Laura is not written as a passive or helpless character even within the context of her captivity. She is witty, she pushes back verbally, she maintains a certain fierce dignity even in impossible circumstances. The film gives her enough agency in small moments to create the impression that she has genuine choice, that her eventual emotional response to her captor is freely given rather than conditioned by the extraordinary power imbalance of her situation. This is perhaps the most sophisticated irony in the entire film, because it uses the appearance of female strength and agency to make a story about the absence of female freedom feel like a story about female desire and choice. The irony of Massimo's character construction. Massimo Torricelli, the male lead, is a Sicilian mafia boss with enormous wealth, physical beauty, and an apparently irresistible personal magnetism. He is also, by any objective measure, a criminal who commits a serious crime against another human being within the opening act of the film and faces no meaningful consequences for it at any point in the narrative. The irony of his character is built into the very structure of how he is written and presented. The film goes to considerable lengths to humanize Massimo and to give his obsession with Laura a romantic rather than a predatory framing. We are shown that he first saw Laura years before the events of the film, during a moment of extreme personal trauma and loss when he was close to death himself. In that moment, he saw her face and something in him held onto it as a reason to survive. The film presents this as the origin of a profound and fated connection, a kind of supernatural romantic destiny that transcends the ordinary rules of social behavior. The irony is that the film is using genuine romantic tropes, fate, destiny, love at first sight, the idea of one person saving another's soul, to justify behavior that those same romantic tropes have never actually justified in any moral framework that most people would recognize as legitimate. Massimo is written with a very specific combination of qualities that is itself deeply ironic. He is simultaneously controlling and gentle, threatening and tender, possessive and protective, violent in his professional world and careful in his personal treatment of Laura. The film deploys this combination deliberately to create a character who feels complex and even admirable, while doing something that is neither complex nor admirable. The irony is that the more humanizing qualities the film gives Massimo, the more effective it becomes at making the audience overlook or minimize the central fact of who he is and what he has done. His moments of tenderness, his apparent self-restraint, and his stated commitment to waiting for Laura to come to him of her own free will are presented as evidence of his love and his essential goodness. The irony is that all of those qualities exist within the context of a situation he has created by force, which makes them not evidence of goodness but evidence of a more sophisticated form of control. The irony of the promise at the film's center. One of the most discussed and most ironic elements of the entire film is the promise that Massimo makes to Laura when she first wakes up in his captivity. He tells her that he has 1 year, 365 days, to make her fall in love with him, and that during that time he will not touch her without her consent. This promise is presented by the film as evidence of Massimo's fundamental respect for Laura and as the moral justification for everything that follows. The promise is also the source of the film's title, making it the literal structural foundation on which the entire narrative rests. The irony of this promise operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The first and most immediate level is the obvious one. The promise of not touching someone without their consent does not address the much larger violation of taking away their freedom, their choice of location, their ability to communicate with loved ones, or their right to simply leave. Promising not to physically assault someone while holding them captive against their will is not a moral position. It is a legal minimum dressed up as a romantic gesture, and the film treats it as the latter. The irony is that the promise, which is supposed to make Massimo more sympathetic and the situation more acceptable, actually makes the irony of the film's framing more extreme rather than less. If the promise of non-assault is supposed to make kidnapping romantic, then the film is revealing something very specific and very troubling about its own moral framework. The second level of irony in the promise is more subtle and perhaps more interesting. The promise creates a clock, a countdown, a ticking timer that gives the film its narrative tension and its forward momentum. The 365 days become a deadline within which the love story must happen, which transforms what should be a story of captivity and resistance into a race against time for a romantic resolution. The irony is that this deadline, which is presented as a kind of romantic ultimatum, is actually a deeply coercive structure. Laura is not simply being given time to fall in love freely. She is being given a specific period within which she is expected to produce a particular emotional response. The difference between those two things is enormous, and the film deliberately blurs that difference in order to make the audience experience the countdown as romantic suspense rather than as the documentation of psychological pressure. The irony of the film's commercial success versus its critical reception. One of the most remarkable and culturally revealing ironies connected to 365 Days has nothing to do with the film's internal narrative but everything to do with what happened to it after it was released on Netflix. The film was received by professional critics with near-universal negative reviews. The critical consensus was harsh, pointed, and in many cases genuinely alarmed by the film's content and its framing. Critics described it as glamorizing kidnapping, romanticizing coercive control, presenting dangerous ideas about consent and desire in ways that were irresponsible given the film's mainstream platform and enormous potential audience. The irony is that none of this critical response had any meaningful effect on the film's commercial performance. It became one of the most watched films on Netflix globally within days of its release. It topped the Netflix charts in an extraordinary number of countries. Its viewership numbers were so large that they generated their own news stories and think pieces about what the film's success said about audiences and about the streaming era of entertainment. The film that critics describe as dangerous and irresponsible was simultaneously the film that tens of millions of people around the world chose to spend their leisure time watching, recommending to friends, and discussing with enthusiasm across every social media platform. This irony, the complete and total disconnect between critical consensus and audience behavior, is one of the most significant cultural facts about 365 days, and it deserves to be examined honestly rather than dismissed. The easy interpretation is that audiences simply have bad taste or that they are not sophisticated enough to recognize the problematic elements of what they are watching. But the easier explanation is not necessarily the accurate one. A more honest examination of the irony suggests that the film was meeting a specific need or desire that the critical establishment either did not recognize or deliberately chose not to acknowledge, and that the scale of the film's success makes it impossible to simply write off that need or desire as the province of an unsophisticated minority. When tens of millions of people across dozens of countries respond to the same piece of content with the same enthusiasm, the interesting question is not whether they are wrong to do so but what the content is giving them that they were apparently not finding elsewhere. The irony of the film's relationship to the romance novel genre. 365 Days was adapted from a Polish novel of the same name written by Blanka Lipinska, and the irony of its source material is itself deeply interesting. The novel belongs to a genre that has existed for centuries and that has produced some of the most commercially successful written entertainment in history, a genre built almost entirely on fantasy, emotional intensity, and the deliberate suspension of the reader's ordinary moral judgment in service of a romantic experience that is more heightened, more dramatic, and more emotionally extreme than anything most readers will encounter in their actual lives. The romance novel genre has always contained within it a significant subgenre built on power imbalance, on the figure of the dominant and controlling male lead who is simultaneously dangerous and irresistible, and on the fantasy of a woman who is chosen so completely and so overwhelmingly by a powerful man that the ordinary rules of choice and consent become irrelevant to the emotional experience of the story. This subgenre has been enormously commercially successful for decades, suggesting that it meets a genuine psychological and emotional need for a significant portion of its readership, a need for a kind of fantasy that is explicitly understood as fantasy and consumed as such within the private space of the reading experience. The irony of 365 Days is that it attempted to take this genre from the private, literary, and clearly fictional space of the novel and translate it directly into the visual, public, and hyperrealistic medium of film without adjusting for the fundamental difference between how those two mediums communicate with their audiences. A reader of a romance novel exists in a relationship with the text that is private, imaginative, and explicitly fictional. The reader knows they are reading a fantasy, and the novel knows it too. But a film, particularly a film released on the world's largest streaming platform and watched by tens of millions of people simultaneously, exists in a very different cultural space. Its visual reality, its beautiful locations, its charismatic actors, and its cinematic language all work together to make the fantasy feel not like a story being read but like a world being witnessed. The irony is that what worked as private literary fantasy became public visual content, and that transition changed everything about how the material landed in the cultural conversation. The irony of the film's setting and its visual language. 365 Days is visually one of the most beautiful films produced in Europe in recent years. It was filmed primarily in Sicily and Poland, two locations with extraordinary natural beauty and architectural richness that the film's cinematography exploits to its maximum advantage. The Sicilian coastline, the luxury yachts, the fashion houses, the magnificent Italian estates, the crystal blue Mediterranean water, all of these elements combine to create a visual world of such extraordinary glamour and beauty that the eye is constantly rewarded regardless of what the narrative is doing at any given moment. The irony of this visual language is that it is doing enormous ideological work that the film itself never openly acknowledges. By placing the story of a kidnapping within this world of extraordinary luxury and beauty, the film is using aesthetics as a moral argument. The implicit logic being communicated through the visuals is that this world is too beautiful and too glamorous for anything that happens within it to be truly wrong. The yachts and the Sicilian sunsets and the designer clothes are not simply the backdrop of the story. They are part of the argument the film is making about the story. They are saying, continuously and wordlessly, that this is a world where ordinary rules do not apply, where the normal moral calculus of right and wrong is suspended in favor of something more rarefied and more intense. The further irony of the visual language is that it is borrowed entirely from legitimate and celebrated filmmaking traditions. The luminous cinematography, the careful attention to composition and light, the use of location as emotional atmosphere, all of these are techniques associated with serious and respected European cinema. By deploying these techniques in service of its specific story, 365 Days is using the visual grammar of artistic legitimacy to give credibility and beauty to content that many critics argued deserved neither. The irony is that the film looks like a serious and beautiful European art film while being something very different in terms of its moral and narrative ambitions. The irony of the film's position in the Me Too cultural moment. Perhaps the most striking and historically specific irony of 365 Days is the fact of when it arrived. The film was released on Netflix in June of 2020, exactly in the middle of one of the most intense and sustained global conversations about consent, power, and the treatment of women by powerful men that the modern world had ever witnessed. The Me Too movement, which had begun in 2017 and gathered extraordinary momentum in the years that followed, had fundamentally changed the public conversation about exactly the kinds of power dynamics and violations of consent that 365 Days depicts as romantic and desirable. The irony of a film celebrating the romantic potential of a powerful man who takes a woman without her consent achieving its enormous commercial success in 2020, at the precise cultural moment when the world was most actively engaged in condemning exactly that kind of power dynamic in real life, is historically remarkable. It suggests something complicated and important about the relationship between public moral discourse and private desire, about the difference between what people say they believe and what they actually respond to when given the anonymous freedom of a private streaming experience. The film's success in this specific cultural moment generated some of the most intense critical backlash it received, because critics and commentators saw in that success a contradiction of everything that the previous 3 years of public conversation had supposedly established about how audiences understood and evaluated the relationship between powerful men and less powerful women. The irony is that the cultural conversation had changed the public language around these issues without necessarily changing the private desires and fantasies that 365 Days was meeting so successfully. People were saying different things about power and consent in public while watching 365 Days in private, and the gap between those two things is one of the most honest and uncomfortable things that the film's success revealed about the cultural moment it arrived in. The irony of the film's impact on tourism. One of the more unexpected and genuinely funny ironies connected to 365 Days is what happened to tourism in the Sicilian locations where the film was shot following its massive commercial success on Netflix. The film used several real and identifiable locations in Sicily as its primary settings, and those locations, which the film depicts as the glamorous and sun-drenched backdrop of a forbidden romance, became tourist destinations for fans of the film who wanted to visit the places where the story unfolded. The irony here is layered and delicious. Sicily is an island with a complex and often painful relationship to its own cultural image in global popular entertainment, having been depicted for decades primarily through the lens of organized crime, the mafia, and the Godfather mythology. The island's actual tourism industry had spent years working to promote Sicily's genuine cultural richness, its extraordinary food, its archaeological heritage, its natural beauty, and its warm and sophisticated local culture as alternatives to the mafia imagery that dominated international perceptions of the place. Then 365 days arrived, depicting Sicily as the home of a glamorous and powerful mafia boss who kidnaps a woman for romantic purposes, and significant numbers of people began adding Sicilian locations to their travel wish lists specifically because of the film. The tourism that the film generated was real and economically meaningful, but it was generated by the very mafia mythology that Sicilian tourism officials had been trying to move beyond. The island was receiving visitors who had been attracted by the romantic image of exactly the cultural association that the island's own tourism promoters were working to escape. The irony of the sequel's existence. 365 Days was commercially successful enough to generate not one but two sequels, and the existence of those sequels is itself one of the most revealing ironies connected to the entire franchise. The original film ends on a cliffhanger that left the fate of one of its main characters genuinely uncertain, a narrative decision that functioned simultaneously as an artistic choice about how to end a story and as a commercial strategy designed to guarantee audience return for a continuation. The irony of the sequels is that they were produced and released in direct response to the enormous audience that the first film built, which means that the commercial ecosystem of the streaming era rewarded the first film's controversial content by funding and platforming more of it. The critical establishment's negative response to the original film had zero effect on the commercial calculus that determined whether sequels would be made. The sequels were made because the audience numbers justified them, and that fact is its own kind of irony, illustrating perfectly the way that the economics of the streaming era operate entirely independently of critical consensus or cultural commentary about the social responsibility of popular entertainment. The further irony of the sequels is that they attempted to develop the relationship between the two leads in ways that addressed some of the criticism of the original, introducing more complexity and more genuine conflict into the dynamic between the characters. But by the time the sequels arrived, the audience had already formed its attachment to the version of the story told in the original film, and any modifications or complications introduced in subsequent installments were filtered through the emotional framework established in the first viewing experience. The ironies introduced by trying to make sequels that were simultaneously true to the original and responsive to the criticism of the original created a creative tension that the sequels never fully resolved. The irony of what the film says about desire and autonomy. At its deepest level, the most profound irony of 365 Days is what it reveals about the complex and often contradictory relationship between desire and autonomy in human psychology. The film is built on a fantasy of being desired so completely and so overwhelmingly that the ordinary requirements of mutual negotiation, compromise, and the slow building of genuine intimacy become unnecessary. Massimo does not want to negotiate with Laura or build something with her gradually and collaboratively. He wants her completely, immediately, and with a totality that leaves no room for the ordinary ambivalence and complexity of real human relationships. The irony is that this fantasy, however problematic its expression in the film's narrative, touches something real and recognizable in human emotional life. The desire to be chosen with that kind of overwhelming certainty, to matter so completely to another person that they organize their entire existence around the need for you, is not something that exists only in problematic films or novels. It is a recognizable human emotional experience that appears throughout literature, music, art, and personal testimony across every culture and every historical period. The irony of 365 Days is that it takes this genuine human emotional need and uses it in service of a narrative that most people would recognize as harmful if encountered in real life rather than on screen. The deepest and most uncomfortable irony of the entire film is therefore not about the film at all but about the audience that responded to it so enthusiastically. The tens of millions of people who watched 365 Days and felt something powerful in response to it were not necessarily endorsing kidnapping or coercive control as acceptable behaviors in the real world. They were responding to the emotional core of the fantasy the film was offering, the fantasy of being desired without reservation, chosen without hesitation, and wanted with a completeness that leaves no room for doubt. That the film packages this emotional fantasy in a narrative built around a criminal act is the irony. That the packaging worked so effectively that the criminal act became almost invisible behind the emotional experience is the deeper irony. And that the emotional experience it offered was genuine enough to generate one of the most significant commercial successes in the history of streaming entertainment is the deepest irony of all. The irony of what the film reveals about the streaming era. The final and perhaps most historically significant irony of 365 Days is what its success reveals about the specific nature of the streaming era of entertainment, and how that era has changed the relationship between content, audience, and cultural gatekeeping. In the era of theatrical film releases, a film's commercial performance was significantly shaped by critical reception, marketing spend, and the social experience of going to a cinema, which involves public choice and social visibility in ways that a private streaming decision does not. A film that received the kind of critical response that 365 Days received would have struggled to build the same kind of commercial momentum through theatrical release that it achieved almost instantly on Netflix. The streaming era changed this calculus completely. On a platform like Netflix, the private and anonymous nature of the viewing experience removes the social visibility and the critical filter from the consumption decision in a way that theatrical viewing never did. A person who watches 365 Days on Netflix in their own home is making a private choice in a private space without any of the social calculation that goes into a public cinema visit. The algorithm that recommends content on streaming platforms does not apply moral filters or cultural judgments. It applies engagement metrics, and 365 Days generated engagement metrics that were extraordinary by any standard. The irony is that the same technological infrastructure that has given audiences more access to more diverse and ambitious content than any previous generation in history has also created a commercial environment that is, in certain important ways, less susceptible to the kind of cultural gatekeeping that once moderated the relationship between controversial content and mainstream audiences. 365 Days did not have to convince critics, cultural commentators, or cinema owners to give it access to its audience. It needed only to be placed on a platform and left there, and the audience came to it in numbers that made every critical objection economically irrelevant. The irony of the streaming era is that it democratized access to entertainment, while simultaneously removing some of the social and cultural mechanisms that once shaped how controversial content was received and discussed. That is a complete and detailed examination of the ironies running through 365 Days as a film and as a cultural phenomenon. If you found this kind of deep analytical breakdown genuinely interesting and different from anything else you have seen on this topic, please hit that like button right now because it helps this channel reach the audience that loves this kind of serious and honest film analysis. Share this video with anyone you know who watched 365 Days and had strong feelings about it in either direction, because the conversation it generates is exactly the kind of conversation this channel is built around. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell so you are always the first to see our next video. We will see you there.